This paper is entitled The Social Ontology of the Sovereign State, a Critical Assessment. Many of us political theorists, perhaps indeed most of us, at least in the Western world, are in the throes of a profound misconception about how social life is and ought to be construed. That misconception is sufficiently foundational that it shapes our thinking about a wide range of concepts relevant to any interesting account of political life, including the concept of the people, citizenship, public authority, political legitimacy, social justice, liberty, constitutionalism, and rule of law. The misconception I have in mind is a certain way of thinking about the structure of social life and the problem of social coordination that severely downplays the relevance of a wide array of associations to the challenge of constructing an acceptable and workable social order. Social ontology, as I understand it, is a picture of how social order is built and maintained over time. Doing social ontology requires imagination, since we must picture in our mind how the different units of social order function and how they are bound together into a meaningful whole. Social ontology can be used to justify a certain distribution of social power. For example, if you believe that a certain class of persons is unfit to govern their own lives, and this is a defining feature of your social ontology, then you may use this to justify a hierarchical, class-based form of political rule. In this paper, I wish to critically analyze the social ontology presupposed by the construct of the sovereign state, as it has been transmitted to us from Hobbes, Locke, Kant, Rousseau, and Rawls. The basic thesis, stated simply, is that a certain conception of political society that we find in the liberal tradition of Hobbes, Locke, and Kant as a sovereign people governed by a sovereign state is the fruit of an arbitrarily austere, reductively individualist picture of how a functional society is built up and maintained, and that once the inadequacy of this picture is exposed, the state-centric approach to social coordination loses much of its appeal. Whereas one well-known criticism of liberal theory is that it is built on an excessively individualistic, socially emaciated conception of the person, the target of my criticism of a certain strand of liberal theory is the type of social ontology that undergirds its account of civil order. This criticism, to the best of my knowledge, is not yet well developed in literature. If I am right, then we should reconsider complex and group-sensitive alternatives to the austere, hyper-individualistic social ontology that is largely taken for granted by state-centric forms of political theory. A more complex and group-sensitive social ontology may open the door to promising alternative conceptions of politics, civil order, and public authority, alternatives that are hidden from view by the social ontology of the sovereign state. The argument will proceed in three stages. First, I explain how the social ontology implicit in the political theories of modern state-centric theorists of civil order such as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and Rawls is one that gives primacy to two types of actors in the constitutional of social order, individuals and states, while downplaying the role of a wide range of intermediate associations. Second, I argue that this marginalization of groups other than the state in discussions of the foundations of social order and public authority is defective as an explanation of social order, even if it is understandable as a strategy for legitimating the sovereign state and vindicating it against potential competitors. Third, I argue that by arbitrarily marginalizing groups other than the state in their account of the constitutional social order, modern defenders of the sovereign state unfairly render less state-centric solutions to coordination problems practically irrelevant, since non-state-centric solutions, for example, a League of Free Cities, can only be seen to be relevant against the backdrop of a complex, multi-group social ontology. The social contract tradition of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau epitomizes this sociologically austere approach, insofar as it portrays the task of building a functional social order as a social contract entered into by free individuals, uncoupled from any pre-existing social structures. Many modern governments have reflected this ontological austerity in their legitimating narratives, most dramatically during the American and French revolutions. Modern Western governments have tended to rest their authority and prerogatives not merely on some abstract concept of right, but on the notion that they are somehow authorized in their public functions by the will of the people who fall under their sway. Although the precise meaning and history of popular sovereignty are contested, what seems undeniable is that one important element of the social imaginary of our democratic era is the notion that the people as a whole, typically the people of a nation, somehow authorize a single body of rulers to oversee their common affairs, whether through an explicit grant of power or through some form of tacit consent. The emergence of the modern nation-state as we know it today would be unthinkable without some narrative of this sort. This ontologically austere or minimalist account of society envisages social coordination as a game to be played out and negotiated among independent individuals, rather than among actors representing the needs and interests of a complex network of associations. The narrative of the sovereign people and the sovereign state serving at its pleasure obviously involves a significant simplification, because it assumes that the will of a large and complex society can be represented within a single assembly. This requires us to turn a blind eye to the heterogeneous character of social groups whose ends and values are not easily reconciled within a single association. I would respectfully suggest that modern political philosophy, at least since Thomas Hobbes published his masterpiece Leviathan in 1651, has been guilty of one gross oversimplification, reiterated time and time again, an oversimplification that has profoundly damaged our ability to grasp and adequately tackle the quest for civil order. In other words, the challenge of living together in peace and harmony. The simplification I am referring to is the reduction of the problem of civil order from a problem of highly complex, multilateral, interpersonal and intergroup coordination to a problem of interpersonal coordination within a single social group. This simplification is achieved by projecting a philosophical abstraction, namely the idea of a single group of individuals solving a single group problem, such as personal survival and the arbitration of disputes, over a social landscape constituted by diverse groups of individuals with diverse group problems. Essentially, social order is flattened into one dimension so that a one-dimensional solution can be proposed to the problem of social order. A single state embodied in a parliamentary assembly, judiciary, and administrative apparatus, overseeing the affairs of a single group of citizens. Once one sets up the problem of social coordination along ontologically austere lines, the complicated task of negotiating a functional and acceptable institutional framework for a large society is naturally understood as the work of individuals, tacitly or overtly endorsing a shared horizon of civility. But this highly austere image of social order overlooks the fact that individuals typically satisfy their personal and group needs in ways that are mediated through low and high-level associations, as well as interassociational alliances, rather than through some form of deal struck directly between all of the individuals inhabiting a region. The negotiation of mutually acceptable solutions to social problems brings into play the perspectives and purposes of a wide variety of independent and overlapping associations, large and small. While some problems may be solved, at least to some degree, by high-level associations operating nationally or transnationally, many others are solved intra- or inter-associationally at the local level. If one views society through an individualist lens, as a giant collection of individuals trying to solve interpersonal problems requiring a single overarching solution, then the most conspicuous and visible source of public order is the state. It seems to tower above the social fabric as a unique and unrivaled benefactor of order and civility. Yet if one begins to scratch beneath the surface, one finds that social order is in fact governed by an extraordinarily diverse and wide-ranging array of institutions, norms, and governance structures, many of which are not creations of the state. Social order is generated by a rich array of interpersonal and intergroup cooperative schemes whose complexity could not possibly be mastered, designed, or comprehensively regulated by any discrete individual or institution. The source of social order, contrary to some popular wisdom and contrary to what is assumed by many modern political philosophers, is not in fact the state, or at least not predominantly the state, but rather a complex web of associations and communities, some existing parallel to one another and others overlapping, some enjoying close forms of cooperation and others aggressively competing with each other for adherence, associations and communities whose normative orders, whether partially codified as in the laws of a municipality or largely informal as in the rules of a university department, are always configured by some shared understanding of group purposes and group life. These plural sources of social order, existing alongside and not only in subordination to state authority, can easily be missed if one's philosophical imagination is dominated by the image of society as a collection of freestanding individuals submitting to a single, seamless, overarching civil order or a single social contract. A pluralist and group-sensitive approach to social order, unlike its monistic, statist counterpart, is especially attentive to the fact that different social relations are governed by different normative orders, or clusters of social norms, customs, and rules of coordination. For example, schools, universities, small, medium, and large businesses, networks of scientists, worker cooperatives, townships and municipalities, churches, guilds, philanthropic associations, residential associations, athletic associations, community centres, and debating clubs are all governed by distinct normative orders. Social order is the natural consequence of associational activity in all its rich variety and cannot be planned or imposed systematically from the top down. Consequently, if we want to understand the sources of justice and civility in a modern society, we must look beyond the traditional narrative of the sovereign state, imposing order upon a single set of citizens from the top down through public law and administration, and begin to take seriously the possibility that social order has many different sources that do not take their place within a neat hierarchy of institutions controlled by a single territorial government. Much contemporary political theory seems to implicitly lean toward the monocentric statist position, inasmuch as it takes for granted the unity, social salience, and normative supremacy of the national political community as a unique, overarching association governed by the institutions of a unitary state. Even when political theorists do not explicitly deny the normative validity and practical viability of polycentric governance, they all too often treat as paradigmatic the notion of a single state introducing order within its domain on behalf of the people at large. The notion of the state as the predominant, if not exclusive, source of public order and justice dominates political theory because it is rarely problematized, and polycentric alternatives are, in many cases, barely acknowledged as respectable rivals worth engaging with. By arbitrarily marginalizing groups other than the state in their account of the constitution of social order, defenders of the sovereign state unfairly render less state-centric solutions to coordination problems practically irrelevant, since non-state-centric solutions can only be seen to be relevant against the backdrop of a complex multi-group social ontology. If you present society primarily as a collection of individuals in search of a society-wide solution to problems of violence, dispute resolution, and mutual coordination, then you are primed to look to large society-wide institutions for a solution. A reductively individualist social ontology naturally tends toward political monocentrism. That is, the view that public order can only be generated and maintained if tightly controlled from one centre. But once we expose the arbitrariness of the austere social ontology of Hobbes, Locke, Kant, and Rawls, and recognize the explanatory superiority of a more complex, group-sensitive and polycentric account of social order, the bias towards state-centric solutions evaporates. Once we start to see society as a complex order constituted by many diverse and heterogeneous social groups, we are more disposed to accept that public order can be generated and maintained through multilateral controls dispersed across different governmental units, without any single unit monopolizing or unilaterally controlling public power and authority. A complex group-sensitive social ontology that recognizes the indispensable role played by local associations in servicing their members' needs and interests is less liable to form an exaggerated view of the power of the state to confer order on social life, and is more likely to look favorably upon polycentric philosophies of governance, such as federalism.